We're here with Os Guinness this afternoon, and we have several questions for Os about his understanding and insight into the connection of faith and culture and public policy. So I want to start out with a couple things. You've maintained in a lot of your writing that the three most important issues facing the global community are, one is, will the West continue secularizing? Will Islam modernize peacefully? And what worldview will replace Marxism as the dominant one in China? I know this is a hazardous business, but play prophet, if you would, for a minute. And what 20 years from now, how do you think we will have answered those questions?
Well, Scott, let me make clear, I don't say those are the most important. I'm saying those are three of the issues where a grand global question has a religious dimension. Whereas many people, if you move into international relations, they ignore the religious dimension, which is kind of the X factor. It is so crucial. Now, I am not a prophet, small p or capital P. I am not a prophet. At the moment, though, I would say about the third one, that the West seems hell-bent on severing its roots. That doesn't mean it's going to be secularized totally, not at all. Secularism is powerful, but you can see various new religions. For example, if you go to Silicon Valley, you can see the rise of a new Gnosticism. Mind, boundless, brilliant and infinite, body, limited and bad. And you get something very close like ancient Gnosticism growing out of highly modern stuff from Silicon Valley. So I would say at the moment, short of revival or the church reforming profoundly, the West looks as if it's on course to sever its roots rather than recover them.
All right, and what about Islam modernizing peacefully? Where do you think that's headed?
Well, once again, we can see different trends going in different directions at the moment. In other words, it's not clear. So many people ignore the fact that modernity, fully understood, is the greatest acid corroding traditional certainties ever. So it's corroding Islam, just as it's sadly corroded much of the church. So you see, more Muslims, globally speaking, have been shaken loose from their traditional certainties than ever before. And in parts of the world like, say, Indonesia, the largest Muslim majority country in the world, you have millions of them who are shaken loose from Islam and looking for something different. So we can count on modernity to corrode Islam. At the same time, in a very different way, we can see many Muslims coming to accept Jesus because of the power of dreams. And clearly the Holy Spirit is at work, giving them dreams of Jesus, and they are coming to Christ through that, which is incredibly wonderful in a different direction. But I'm also concerned we need, as Christians, not just Christians, as citizens in America and the West, to teach the new Muslim arrivals what are the core principles of the way we live, such as freedom of conscience. So as it were, as they move from the Middle East to the West, they are now, put it in their terms, in our tent. If you go to a sheikh's tent, you would eat as the sheikh eats. And they are in our tent. And here in the West, we believe in freedom of conscience. We believe in religious freedom, etc., etc. So notions such as death penalty for conversion is totally out. The blasphemy laws, no. So when they're in our part of the world, we teach them the way we behave, and then they integrate into our world. So there's a number of issues all tied up in that. One is modernity, another is the way the Lord is directly appealing to them, but the third is the way we integrate them into our societies through civic education.
Okay. We'll come back to some of the questions about immigration in Europe, particularly in just a minute. But you were born in China and spent 10 years of your life there before going to England for education. I know have a fondness for China. What do you think will replace Marxism as the dominant worldview in China in the years to come?
Well, that's not clear yet either. In other words, under Xi Jinping, China has gone towards an authoritarian stance, and many of the churches and Wenbao and so on have been really stamped out. No question that's so. But talking to friends whom I've met who are members of the party and Christians, One of my friends, very high in the Communist Party, actually said to Hu Jintao, "I've become a Christian. Should I resign from the party?" And Hu said, "No, stay. We need people like you." And there are more and more like that at different levels of the Communist Party. Now the question, if that keeps developing in 20 years' time, rather like a building eaten by white ants, the Communist Party will collapse and Christian leadership will emerge. But it's too soon to say.
And you hold that Marxism has already collapsed as a worldview in China?
Marxism, in its traditional Marxist sense, has failed. And the Soviet Union and its collapse signaled that clearly. But what you might call a cultural Marxism, that combination of Marxism with a Antonio Gramsci style, who talked of the long march through the institutions, who talked of winning gatekeepers, the people astride the doorways of influence and power, that is more powerful than ever. And I would say that the left liberalism of the United States is actually very close to a cultural Marxism. So Marxism in that form is far from collapsed.
Say a little bit more about that, especially as it relates to the United States. You would say the revival of left liberalism, not the capital L sort of classic liberalism that we refer to. Distinguish between those two first of all, and then you've held that that's on the rise here again in the United States.
Well, I wouldn't say it's on the rise because it never was popular. In other words, America was a liberal project with a capital L, and socialism had never made inroads into America. So the idea of a candidate like, say, Bernie Sanders, who'd had his honeymoon in Moscow, would have been unthinkable a while back. And it was always taken that Americanism was the antidote to left-wing socialism. So it's not a revival of it, it's an emergence of something new. And I argue that it happened in the mid-1960s, and the way the feminists, the anti-war movement and others took over the legacy of civil rights and created a liberal shame, a white shame very often. And that liberalism project with a capital L shifted to a left liberalism, which has dominated the universities, dominated the press and media, dominated entertainment and Hollywood really ever since. So the extremes are way out in the extremes, like Antifa or Antifa, the anti-fascist movement. And you remember Huey Long, the old governor of Louisiana. He said, when fascism comes to America, it will be in the guise of anti-fascism. And you can see that things like Antifa are truly the fascism of our day, stamping out freedom of speech and dissent.
You've mentioned that the church has moved south from the West to places like, say, Latin America, Africa, and China. There may be more Christians in the years to come than anywhere in the world. What's your sense of the vibrancy of the church in the South, maybe strengths and weaknesses, and how it's responding to that shift?
Well, the church in the global South is exploding, and the figures are accurate, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa or Asia, countries like China or Korea. Absolutely remarkable and incredibly inspiring. But I always add the sting in the tail. Much of the global South is pre-modern. And what is done in the church in the West is its capitulation to the advanced modern world, which means very simply their challenge is coming because they will modernize. You take, say, Industrial Revolution came in England with a spinning jenny and things like that. It's coming to Africa with cell phones throughout the villages. But modernity is coming. And the question is, do they have a faithfulness and discipleship able to prevail against the challenges of the modern world which are coming to the global South? Thank God for their health and vitality today, numerically, spiritually, and so on. But we need to humbly warn them of what's coming, which we didn't do a good job of resisting.
And by we, I assume you mean the West as a whole.
Yeah.
Is that correct? If the West continues to secularize on the path that it's been on, do you see anything that could potentially ground human rights, intrinsic dignity of the human person, and individual liberty? If not, how long can the West live off the borrowed capital of Christianity?
The West is a cut flower civilization. We owe a lot to the Greeks, philosophy, democracy, science, various things like that. We owe a considerable amount to the Romans, above all governance, also things like central heating. But the principal roots of the West go back to scriptures and to the gospel, such as human rights based in dignity, freedom based in the notion of people made in the image of God, equality because we're children of God, equal in his sight. We're not equal in any other way. You look, say, at the French Revolution, where they didn't have God, they held equality and they leveled everyone. And that's what socialism does without a real standard. You can see the West is a cut flower. America is a cut flower civilization. The things that have made America great and so on, the roots have been cut. You cannot ground them in atheism, secularism.
You had suggested that one of the threats to the church in the global south is as those cultures modernize, it makes it more challenging for the church to maintain its faithfulness to the gospel. It's sort of conventional wisdom, I think, in a lot of the circles that we run in, that as modernization occurs, secularization also occurs. How would you assess that secularization thesis that sees those two things working in tandem?
Well, I am dead against the secularization theory. So from Auguste Comte, the sociologist, the father of sociology, for 200 years you had that secularization theory. Even great people like Max Weber believed it. In other words, the more modern we are, the less religious we become. Put simply, religion disappears. That is wrong. Thank God in the 60s, it was actually a great sociologist who also happened to be an Anglican minister, David Martin, at the London School of Economics, who challenged that. In other words, the secularization theory is doubly wrong. On the one hand, it's factually wrong. The world is explosively religious as ever. But it's also philosophically biased. In other words, they smuggled in secularist assumptions into the theory and then got their own conclusions out. Garbage in, garbage out sort of thing. So it was doubly wrong. But that doesn't mean that modernity leaves us all well and fine. Not at all. There are areas in which we have been secularized in a certain sense. I have 3 examples. I was talking about them in the Biola Chapel this morning. But one of them is simply the way the modern world shifts us from a supernatural reality to a mundane secular reality. So in the traditional world, what was unseen was not unreal. It was actually more real than the seen. Whereas in our modern world, what is unseen is unreal. We talk about the real world of business, politics, science, the measurable outcomes, things like that. That's the real world. No. We should be like Elisha, praying that the Lord would open his servant's eyes so he can see horses and chariots of fire. The unseen world is more real than the seen world, but modern Christians often are atheists unawares. They're operational, functional atheists. So there is a certain secularization, but that's not the secularization theory. Religion is never going to disappear. I would argue, even anthropologically, humans need some ultimate source of meaning and belonging, and the deepest source of it all is, in fact, religion. It might be bad religion, false religion, but they still need it. We would argue for true faith, but humans will never get beyond some need for faith.
Would you say when it comes to secularism, some of the question would be not so much does somebody have a spiritual intuition and need in the modern world, but it's an episteme, a way of knowing. So religion, yes, a ton of people consider themselves religion, and it's religious and it's not disappearing. But is secularism taking over amidst that the way that people think about the world and their life and how they really their worldview?
Part of the myth, the illusion of modernity is that the secular worldview is enough. The fact is it isn't. You take say C.S. Lewis, a hardcore atheist. What triggered his search, which took more than 10 years until he came to Christ, it was what he called being surprised by joy. In other words, the joy was not pleasure. It wasn't happiness. it transcended, it pointed beyond that. It couldn't be explained by his atheism. And there are a lot of atheists who are jolted into thinking because secularism doesn't ultimately satisfy. Now, I was arguing earlier, there are many of the big questions you can't answer, such as freedom. Read Sam Harris, one of the new atheists. Freedom is an illusion. The very cover of his book shows a picture of puppets. Well, that's all we are. We're the victim of our genes. Freud, our childhood. Go back to the Babylonians, it would have been our stars. Go to the Greeks, it would have been fate. In other words, you have in all these pagan religions, including secularism, you have determinism, reductionism, fate, not freedom. You only have freedom in the biblical understanding. Humans are made in the image of God. God is, a lot of Christians say, is God free like that? Well, why? Take the notion of sovereignty. What does sovereignty mean? God can exert his will despite any opposition or interference of any sort. He's sovereign. We're not sovereign, but we are significant. And freedom means we're able to exercise our will despite interference and restraint. So we are free and responsible. That's why we're morally culpable and so on. But that's a biblical view you cannot find in either secularism or ancient paganism.
In your book, The Global Public Square, you point out that one of the most important questions we have to address today is how can we get along despite our deepest, most heartfelt convictions and differences. Your book came out before the current administration is in place. Where do you see the United States on the spectrum? Are you encouraged by where we are moving toward getting along despite deepest differences, or do you think we have moved backward?
Oh, I don't think so you're moving backward, but I think you're slipping downwards. In other words, America today is suffering its gravest crisis since the Civil War. America is more bitterly divided, politically, culturally, religiously, racially, economically, than at any time since before the Civil War. And the question is, what are the deepest differences? It's obviously not Republican against Democrat. It's obviously more than what they say, heartlanders against coastals, or liberals and conservatives. And the new differences, they say, between globalists and nationalists. Well, all of those have an element of truth. I don't think they go deep enough. I think the deepest difference in America is actually a fundamental difference in freedom. A type of freedom which comes from 1776 and the American Revolution, which is decisively shaped by the scriptures and a Christian and Jewish view of humanity and so on, and a view of freedom which comes from 1789 and the Enlightenment and thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and people like that. That is actually the fundamental difference over which many Americans are fighting. So it's about freedom. And you can see the irony. Just before the Civil War, Lincoln said, everyone's talking of freedom, but they all mean different things. In other words, freedom was different for the Northerner than for the Southerner. And in the same way today, freedom is different for those who are following the American Revolution and those who, without realizing it very often, are following the French Revolution. And of course, the French Revolution interpreted by Gramsci, Marcuse, Foucault, and thinkers since then.
Another good reason to be a continual good student of history.
Absolutely.
Let me take this one step further. You suggest in the Global Public Square that the notion of the civil public square is a very important concept for the future and health of our civilization. What exactly do you mean by that, and how would you encourage the institutions to foster that kind of environment?
Well, we're answering the question, what's the best model, the best option for handling diversity? You've really got three models, options around the world. The sacred public square, where one religion is dominant. It might be a mild version. For instance, the Church of England is the established church in England, about as mild as you can get, hanging on by the skin of its teeth to its establishment, but still an establishment, and those who are not Anglican feel second class. Then you have extreme versions of it, like Pakistan, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, where people who don't share the majority faith, Islam, are really in trouble. Or take, say, the Muslims in Myanmar, Burma, where they are Muslims in a Buddhist majority country. So I'm opposed to the sacred public square because it doesn't give justice and freedom for everybody. The other extreme is the naked public square, where you remove religion altogether, and the simple fact is that 80% of the world at least is religious, so they're discounted. And then, of course, you smuggle in secularism to be the dominant faith through the back door. So the civil public square is the alternative to those extremes, but it needs to be unpacked and it needs to be taught through civic education so every generation knows what it is and what they're required to be as citizens.
Including recent immigrants, you might even say especially recent immigrants as well as children.
Especially. Now, if you take the American motto, e pluribus unum, out of many one, what gave the unum? Because America was always very diverse. In the old days, it was public school education, and specifically civic education, and it was called the melting pot at one stage. You don't not like that term, but it was very effective. So people in Europe who thought in groups came and were Americanized, became individuals. People in Europe who were thinking of the past tradition became forward-looking, and so you could go on. People in Europe thought in terms of blood and kinship. Here they talked of beliefs and ideals. The melting pot really did something very powerful, but that's gone. So now, unless you have civic education for the immigrants, immigration will eventually put more stamp on America than the revolution. And the republic, as the founders set up, will have gone.
Let me back up just a step. I think when most people think about the term civility, they think of something really different than what you're referring to. They refer to some being inoffensive, sort of being perpetually nice. You're referring to something really different by that concept. Can you spell out what you mean by that?
People take civility as a matter of niceness or a fear of being offensive, as you say. It's not at all. It's a duty, a virtue of citizens in a diverse country who have a respect for people, individual worth, and therefore, for instance, for freedom of conscience, but also respect for truth. Without truth, there's only power. This is what Nietzsche saw very clearly, and this is what postmodernism leads to. You have bullying and domination. So people who respect people and people who respect truth learn how to speak with civility. So we disagree, but always respecting a person and respecting the truth and arguing persuasively and not coercively.
So how would you envision, you've watched the immigration debate both in this country and in Europe. How would you envision a civil debate over immigration? Because I think for a lot of people, they look at immigration and civility as being almost mutually exclusive.
Well, they've become that way because people don't think. For example, immigration, there are various levels of discussion. The bottom level is security, and that's right. And so notions like the wall and so on are important. You've got to have security. A person needs boundaries. Someone who doesn't have personal boundaries is in trouble. He or she will become a doormat to everyone else. Everyone needs boundaries. You've got to have boundaries. That's the security issue. But then you move higher. We're talking about the ordering of society with all its differences. Highest of all, we're talking about individual freedom and justice. Now, the trouble is, say, America had its motto, e pluribus unum. Europe didn't have anything like that. Just bring them in. But of course, if you just bring them in, they will change your culture, particularly if you follow multiculturalism. So Sweden, they have what they call the dish cities. Dish cities, and they don't enter Swedish society. They have their antenna out to television from the Middle East. They live totally in their own bubble. Or you have in England the no-go areas, in France the banlieue. So in Britain, through the false multiculturalism, without civic education, etc., we bred the bombers who bombed the London Underground. And the folly of it was palpable because the Europeans didn't have a discussion of the first principles of diverse society. America's been at it for 300 years. You should have been a model to the world, But at the time when the world's looking at you, you're not being the best model you should be.
You mentioned at the heart of civility is respecting other people who see the world differently. And yet the debate today is increasingly framed that if you don't accept my identity or my beliefs, in principle, that's disrespectful. So how do we get back to a sense of civility where we have deep differences about the world and moral principles, yet there's still a respect or care for people?
It's a good example of how liberalism is becoming illiberal. In other words, disagreement is not necessarily discrimination. People are just arguing for different ways of doing things, and that's incredibly important because in a diverse society, dissent or conscientious objection are very, very important principles. But what the sexual revolution has done is paint them all as discrimination, therefore wrong. For example, the Jews point out that discrimination is at the heart of creation. God is the great discriminator. He made heaven and earth. Heaven is for him, the earth is for us. He made male and female, light and darkness. These things are at the heart of creation. And so the tactic of the left to turn everything in discrimination, borrowing from the civil rights movement, is extremely dangerous to freedom. We need the right to dissent. We need the right to have conscientious objection.
So tactically, what would that look like for the church and for pastors and just lay people to help advance that cause?
We've got to challenge liberals to be liberal. In other words, to be clear, what we're standing for in terms of freedom is not bigotry. And we've got to say, in essence, look, this is your way of living. This is the way we've learned from Jesus. There are alternative ways. We each need freedom to follow the ways we think are true and just. Look at us over 20 years and see if this is in fact so, and we'll look at you. Now, this is a grand equivalent to what Elijah did. You remember the people were sitting on the fence. He was up against 850 of the false prophets, and he says, if Baal is God, follow Baal. Now, that's incredibly daring. He knows Baal is not God, but he knows that since Baal is not God, the fastest way for them to know he's not God is for them to try and follow Baal as God when he isn't. And in the same way, we are saying that challenge to many people today. Transgenderism, for example, leads to a loneliness and to an incidence in suicide, which is nothing short of tragic. And if America chooses the way of the sexual revolution, the harvest of social chaos, psychological confusion, and various other ills will be enormous. But let them follow what they think is right. But don't, because we disagree, think that that's bigotry. No, we believe there's a better, higher way.
How important is the American experiment today? I've heard people say, given the compromise of the church, just let it burn and then a new one arise out of the ashes. And I've heard people like Chuck Colson say, no, there's something about the American experiment that's important for the church and the world.
Well, not just the church, for humanity. In other words, there's nothing more daring than the original idea that you could create a free society that could stay free forever. America is the longest running public tutorial in the politics of freedom ever. And if it fails, it will be historically tragic. And I think people said it to me. I was at Berkeley and someone said, things are so bad we just got to burn the whole system down. It wasn't a radical that said that. It was a young woman who was actually sort of weary with the whole thing. And that is absolutely tragic. Something's at stake. Now, the American experiment had flaws. That's the Faustian bargain of the Constitution. But you've got to put it right, not throw out baby bathwater and all.
You've also pointed out that in discussions about same-sex marriage and some of the discussions with the LGBTQ community and the church, that the culture is increasingly resorting to more coercive measures to enforce a uniformity of thought as it relates to marriage and sexuality, and increasingly on marriage of race as well. Yet you also insist that when they do that, the LGBT community and others are, as you put it, sawing off the branch that supports them. What do you mean by that, and how so?
Well, ostensibly they're in favor of freedom. But you go back to Rousseau, he talks about the general will and people being, quote, forced to be free. And you can see that 19th century liberalism, with a capital L, was a concern for the individual liberty, especially over against the government, John Stuart Mill and others. But with the rise of progressivism, the shift has been turned for freedom, but now through the government policy and regulations and so on. And so you get this force to be free of Rousseau coming in. In other words, liberalism again undercutting itself and becoming highly illiberal, and the whiffs of totalitarianism are all from the left. Now, I'm strongly opposed to fascism and anything from the right too, but as I see it, despite the KKK and the white supremacists, they're a tiny group compared with the strength of the left in this country.
Yeah, I think the consensus, is still very strong that those who would promote a white supremacist agenda are morally repugnant and repulsive and should be disdained.
Absolutely.
I don't see that same thing from some of the coercive measures on the left.
No.
Yes, just one other question about where you see America headed in future years. What do you think is the future of the idea that individuals would sacrifice freedom and self-interest for something like the common good? Or do you think, has the common good lost its ability to be a compelling argument or compelling reason for people in the way they order their lives?
Well, in traditional society, people literally depended on others. They literally did. We don't. We have an autonomy and an individualism in the highly modern world. You can live all by yourself. But tragically, the commitment to the commonwealth, the common good, and all these various things, which you see very strongly, say, in New England, the Puritans, has gone. And America now is a rampant autonomous individualism. And you can see it in libertarian freedom. Freedom is just the permission to do what you like. Don't tread on me. And for the liberal, keep off my body. For the conservative, keep off my wallet, or whatever. And you can see that American individualism is a rampant autonomy now, which is simply unrealistic.
Yeah, or keep off my gun collection, among other things.
Religious people have often been accused of imposing their values on unbelievers. Yet you argue that such an accusation cuts both ways. How does secularism attempt to impose their values on the public as a whole?
Well, I see you have the roots of it in notions like Rousseau's being forced to be free. Now, it works out today in terms of, for example, Obama's orders on terms of transgender and bathrooms and so on. An open attempt to improve a minority thing on the majority, and certainly not by people who are elected and held accountable. It was an executive order that pushed it through. So today the imposition is more from the left than conservatives. Now, that said, we shouldn't try and impose anywhere. And the difference between, say, the abolition of slavery and prohibition, Wilberforce, in the abolition of slavery, realized he had to win hearts and minds. Persuasion preceded legislation. Whereas with prohibition, there was no persuasion, just legislation. And it was disastrous. The Bible never prohibits drink in an absolute sense anyway. And to try and coerce it through law rather than persuading people is folly. So we've always got to see hearts and minds before legislation.
One of the things happening here at Biola University is as a result of the changing landscape on marriage and sexuality, Christian colleges and lots of Christian institutions have a target on their back. How would you advise a college like Biola that is somewhat under siege from the legislature and the LGBT community based on our views on marriage and sexuality?
Well, on the one hand, we've got to live our Christian principles so that we see the difference they make. So we are really healthy communities with strong marriages and vibrant learning communities and so on. So we've got to live the way of Jesus vigorously and confidently. But on the other hand, in our public witness, we've really got to go to the core of issues in terms of, say, freedom, and challenge the illiberalism of much of the opposition. You know, currently, for example, this may be controversial, but you have the Nashville Statement. Regardless of what you think of the actual statement, it was very poorly couched as a public declaration. There was no pastoral sensitivity, but for me, equally importantly, there was no prophetic element. There was no, we're addressing the sexual revolution. There was half a line at the beginning. It was pathetic. And here we are with the biggest onslaught against the church in hundreds of years. And they didn't address it prophetically or apologetically, whatever you like to say it. And it's a good example. Almost everything now in public life has to be apologetic in the biblical sense, or prophetic in the biblical sense. And so you've got to train people in order to do that.
I think this is one of the reasons that both Sean and I appreciate your book, Fool's Talk, and for a revival of the skill and the discipline of persuasion in apologetics and evangelism. You know, Sean teaches in our apologetics program. I know you found that book really helpful in serving your students and preparing them to be the next generation of apologists.
Yeah, I thought the opening was fascinating, and it made so much sense where you started by saying we are all apologists anyways. And then you said you consider today the greatest opportunity for witness since the time of Jesus. Why are we all apologists, and why do you feel like it's such a great opportunity for the church today?
Well, by that, the we there is not Christians. In other words, as modern people, you know, with Facebook, etc., the daily me, everyone's presenting themselves in all sorts of ways, and they're basically doing apologetics. So this is the grand age. That was said by a secular sociologist, not by me. I was quoting someone in saying that. But that said, never have there been such openness. Never have we had so many people we can speak to all around the world. This should be the greatest moment for Christian apologetics ever. And never has the gospel shone so clearly. I love the little principle, contrast is the mother of clarity. But if you look at the alternatives to the gospel today, they are extreme. And so the gospel shines brighter and brighter over against the darkness, the craziness, the insanity of many of the alternatives. So it is a magnificent time to be a Christian. And those who are on the back foot and ashamed of their faith or whatever, shame on them. This is an amazing moment, globally, in America, or wherever. Extraordinary moment.
You wrote Fool's Talk to try to encourage Christians to just find and discover or rediscover the art of persuasion. And yet there was a line in there where you described that you waited 40 years to write this book. Could you explain a little bit what's behind that statement?
Well, it's partly because a lot of other things came up that I needed to tackle on the way.
Okay,
But partly
fair
that
enough.
I really wanted to think about it and let it gel and mature like wine. I mean, the two books that came out of the heart of everything I believe, one was The Call, and I had thought about that a long time before I wrote it. The other was Fool's Talk. Those probably are the two books that are the closest to the heart of my own personal wrestlings with faith in the modern world and so on. So I just knew I had to think a lot about it before I wrote it, not rush that one.
So why write it Fool's Talk? Aren't we supposed to not be fools? The Bible speaks against foolishness, and that you're saying we're trying to rediscover this sense of being the fool. What do you mean by that?
Well, the idea is that good apologetics is cruciform. In other words, like the cross. The cross is upside down conversion. Looks complete folly. And yet it is the greatest wisdom and power in a subversive form. And our apologetics should be the same.
You use the terms crosstalk and clever talk. in the book, Fool's Talk. What do you mean by those terms? And how you say we should be about crosstalk?
Well, by clever talk, I mean using fancy modern language and relevance and arguments that all depend on us, whereas that's clever talk. But crosstalk, in other words, that's the wisdom of the world, and it's very easy to use that without thinking. Crosstalk is really making sure that the apologetics we use is shaped by the cross itself and delivered in the power of the Holy Spirit and so on. In other words, when I came to Christ in 1960, I followed Jesus more than 50 years. Apologetics was basically theistic proofs. And that's a long way from biblical apologetics. So we've got to go back, and what does it mean that people hold the truth in unrighteousness? What does it mean to be like the prophets? And so on, to really look into Scripture and see that our theology is shaping the way we persuade and not just using the fancy arguments of our day.
Now, coming to faith when you did in the early 1960s, you were also pretty significantly influenced by the ministry of Francis Schaeffer and Labrie. How did the ministry of Schaeffer and that Labrie community help shape you spiritually in those years?
Well, I came to Christ in 60. And you could say that evangelicalism was broadly pietistic, in a good way. Wonderfully warm hearts, with deep areas of rich theology. We had people like John Stott, Martin Lloyd-Jones, Michael Green, a lot of people, Jim Packer. Deep theologically, but culture? Nothing. And here I came to faith in the 60s, swinging London, the free speech movement, the films of Bergman, Antonioni, Fellini. No one made head or tail of that. Then I met this funny little man with Swiss knickers who went to the blackboard and joined all the dots. I thought, my word, this is incredible. You were free to think about anything and everything under the Lordship of Christ. And that to me was as revolutionary as my conversion. It was, the 60s term, mind-blowing. Yeah. It was literally mind-blowing and liberating. And so I owe everything to Schaeffer in terms of an understanding of apologetics. He's the best one-to-one apologist I've ever seen. Not maybe public speaking, your distinguished father and many others, but I've never seen him one-to-one, but,
he's pretty good. I'll just throw out some love for him,
I'm sure
just for the record. But I agree with you.
Yeah. But Schaeffer was brilliant one-to-one. And you watched him, and a couple of minutes his eyes would be welling with tears. He was so empathetic of the people he was talking to, and so on. So I learned the art of apologetics from Francis Schaeffer. Now, he was strong on the history of ideas. He wasn't good, and I realized I had to learn cultural analysis, and my academic mentor is Peter Berger. And I learned much more from Peter Berger than I did from Francis Schaeffer when it came to academic thinking, but that came later.
Well, it sounds like you had sort of a spiritual conversion and an intellectual conversion a few years later under Schaeffer, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
In Fool's Talk, you say evangelism must be biblical not only in content but in method. That we need to be biblical rather than modern or postmodern. What does that mean to be biblical, not only in terms of what we say, but in, say, the medium or the means by which we say it? What distinction were you drawing there?
Well, if you say modern and postmodern, obviously the modernist apologetics uses reason and counts on reason alone, like the theistic proofs and so on. And I meet people in Washington today still arguing the ontological argument so on to atheists. It's like water off a duck's back. Postmoderns, they don't believe in reason at all. It's all stories and this sort of stuff. Stories are incredibly important. But you look at the scriptures. Romans is discursive, tough-minded reasoning. The parables of Jesus are stories, and so on. So we need clearly both versions, and we need to make sure that our apologetics is deeply biblical and not shaped by the current philosophies of our times.
You also talk about the importance of questions. You spent quite a bit of time in the book walking through the art of asking good questions. Would you talk about that a little bit and why that's so important? Probably all time since Jesus used questions, but maybe even especially today.
Well, questions are subversive. And if you think in Scripture, whenever unbelief or disobedience comes in, questions come in. The fall, Adam, where are you? And you go right through. Jesus is the supreme question asker. What is the questions are indirect, and they're involving. Now, as you don't know where they're leading to, but the person asked the question has to provide the answer. So it's not a question of a proposition, take it or leave it. You have to get into it to get out of it. And that's why questions are much more subversive than statements. And we should be, particularly in a skeptical age, or an age that is self-sufficient in its hostility or resistant to Jesus or the gospel, we should be the great question askers, like Socrates.
Do you have any specific questions you like to ask people in spiritual conversations, or do you find it's just important to tailor the questions to wherever somebody seems to be?
Well, there are broadly two types of question. The first is to discover where people are. We love them. We don't know where they are. Are they, for example, open or closed? You have to ask questions about what makes them tick, where the treasure of their heart is. So questions are very important just in loving people to discover where they are, with the ultimate goal of finding, are they open to the gospel or closed? Then, at the second stage, questions only come in if people are closed. If people are open, give them the answer. Jesus, the good news. But if they're not open, then questions come in. And you're raising questions to make them think in ways that crack the sufficiency of whatever it is they believe. Or put it differently, stage one of a journey to faith is when people have questions. They might be intellectual, they might be emotional, they might be practical, but life, which has been, they've swum through it cheerfully for all this time, suddenly becomes a question and they're forced to think. That's always what constitutes a seeker, and that's what we're aiming for, to prompt people into thinking enough to begin searching.
So stories are very important. Sharing truth is important. But to be able to ask the right questions, it also seems that we need to be pretty good listeners then today.
Absolutely. Listening as an expression of love. No, it's our Lord, in the power of the Spirit, immediately knows where people are. The woman at the well, the rich young ruler, you name it. We don't. So we have to start by asking questions to discover where people are. That's the mark of love.
That's such a good point, because it underscores how important the relational component is in bringing someone to faith.
Yeah.
That those questions, I think, actually help us connect with them relationally as well as challenge their thinking going forward.
Yeah, I met once one of the leaders of ACT UP. Very few teeth in the front of his mouth to show what the police had done to him in New York gay parades and so on.
Wow.
And I asked him how he'd come to faith. And he said, well, I was at the Clinton Foundation in the cocktail hour, and this big teddy bear of a man just put his arm around me and said, tell me a story. He said, an hour later I was telling him my story, and to my horror I realized it was a pastor. It was Rick Warren.
Wow.
He just loved him enough.
Yeah.
Tell me your story and listen to it. And that was an expression of love, which is the beginning of his journey to faith.
Sounds like something I can envision Rick Warren doing.
It does.
It's a wonderful thing.
It definitely does. You talk about two errors in the book, either doing apologetics without evangelism or evangelism without apologetics. And I found that I've seen that regularly, especially today. Why is it important to keep that balance? And how would somebody keep that balance?
They're seamlessly a pair. So evangelism is the sharing of the good news, appropriate to people in a bad situation. Apologetics is the pre-evangelism to people who don't know that they're in a bad situation. So again, we have to ask, where is the person? Open, in which case evangelism, the good news. Or are they closed, in which case the pre-evangelism, apologetics, in order to raise the questions which show them that they need the good news. So they should be together, and yet today very often they're split, and too many people use evangelism everywhere, and they leave apologetics to the eggheads. Great mistake.
I found it really interesting in your book, Fool's Talk, that you spent a significant amount of time on one objection to the faith, because in my work and research with students, I get asked a lot about science and faith, the intersection, get asked how can Jesus be the only way, issues of marriage and sexuality. You spent an entire chapter on one objection, which is hypocrisy. Why did you pick that one, and what are some of your thoughts in responding to that particular objection?
Well, there are obviously many, many objections, and like you, I've heard many of the others too. But hypocrisy is the one that's often not answered, and it's one of the basic ones today. I can't believe in Jesus because all Christians are hypocrites. And the fact is, with the corruptions of the modern church, and we're in a situation where the church today, 500 years after the Reformation, is actually very similar to the 16th century and the state of the church before the Reformation. And at times like that, you turn off others massively. So I think hypocrisy is a great obstacle to the church. Of course, it's not the only one. You're absolutely right about that, Sean. It's not the only one. But our Lord, well, put it another way, as postmoderns and cynics and so on, people care for hypocrisy. They hate it. But they don't have a grounds for hating it. And the simple fact is, for example, you need truth to expose lies, but there's no truth. The greatest counter-hypocrisy program, or the strongest attacks on hypocrisy, were from Jesus. So the deeper you get people to look into it, hypocrisy is second only to evil and suffering as an objection raised. But it's one in which the Christian answer is very clear.
We have time for one final question, and that is, as you look forward to the next decade or so, as the church encounters its various challenges, what's the one thing that you are most encouraged about as you see the church facing the challenges of the next decade?
Well, I often say that if you look at the generalizations, they're bleak, discouraging, pessimistic. And you can pile up the trends. You read a lot of the trends. I don't take them too seriously. The exceptions, though, are magnificently encouraging. And the fact is that the more extreme we get, the contrast of the gospel shines brighter. And with every new crisis, people go, oh, is that where it leads to? What's the answer to that? And in many, many cases, they relatively quickly see that there isn't an answer apart from the biblical answer or the gospel answer or whatever it is. So we're getting pretty extreme. But the extremes are highlighting. Contrast is the mother of clarity. So it sounds perverse, but the more extreme things get, the more encouraging they can be if, with confidence in the gospel, we move out and articulate a Christian response to it.
You're here. Well, we want to thank you, Oz, for spending this time with us. Our guest has been Os Guinness, internationally known author, speaker, and critic of the intersection of faith and culture. And I think we celebrate with you, 5+ decades of biblically faithful, culturally relevant service to the kingdom of God.
Well, thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much for your time and being with us.